Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program Teacher Certification Course. My name is William. I'll be your instructor tonight. Can please be seated. If you're joining us over media, Facebook, on our Facebook page, you can go to the top of the page and there's a drop-down menu to download the manual we'll be in tonight, which is the self-control manual. The teacher's manual is there. If you click down, you'll see a few different manuals that are up there, but we're in the self-control unit. We're going to be picking up on page 192 where the last teacher left off. Let me get my glasses on so I can see what I'm doing. And he was covering page 192, and actually we're in chapter 7, entitled Self-Control in the Environment. And you know, when I first learned the Peaceful Solution, when I first started taking the course, you know, it really struck me that the Peaceful Solution went that in depth into, I mean, I never considered the environment as part of self-control, or, you know, I thought, well, what is the environment? To me, the environment the environment meant trees and rivers and lakes. You know, I didn't, you know, my understanding of the word environment was very limited. But I always thought, you know, well, what does self-control have to do with the environment? You know, like, or how does the environment affect my self-control, I guess is what I was thinking. But it was actually talking about how I treat the environment and how I stop and think and consider my options in what I do with the environment. And the environment, remember, it's not just, with my limited knowledge at the time, trees and lakes and rivers and streams. I grew up in Alaska. It's a very beautiful environment there. But it's also, you know, it's our surroundings, our area. You know, it could be our living room, our bathroom, our bedroom. You know, it's where we are. It's our surroundings. So self-control has everything to do with the environment, okay? And, you know, Chris mentioned last class, you know, he said when we're teaching the Peaceful Solution, I wrote his quote down because I thought it was pretty profound. He said, you really need to take it to the micro level with the students, to the micro level, you know, because it's more than just air, food, and water. You know, that this is talking about, that this is dealing with in this chapter, you know, and that's why, you know, when people think of pollution and they think of the environment, they're very limited in their scope because they only think about things they can see, like the, you know, see around them. They don't think on the micro level, or the microbes, the microorganisms that are actually there, that are living, you know. And I never considered it either. You know, I think when biology classes were offered to me in high school, I think I just, you know, to me, I guess you could call me a biology punk, you know, because I didn't think it was important. But the older I got and the more educated I got, I started seeing that, you know, the environment, or the biology, things we can't see, the things that we think are the least, that we can't even see, you know, without a microscope, are not important. And when really, actually, they're the most important, because they make up everything we can see. Without those, we wouldn't have the things we can see. You know, I remember the author of The Peaceful Solution in one of our conferences talking about, you know, the beams here in the Peaceful Solution headquarters. The steel beams are made out, you know, they're made from steel, but the steel are made up of microorganisms, you know, that you can't see, atoms, etc. That, you know, you'd have to use microscopes that are 50,000 times, you know, that would reduce something at least 50,000 to 100,000 times to be able to even see these little critters. But he said they're what make that beam solid. You know, he said if you could reduce your size down to the micro level, they'd be all hitting your face, and you know, you would be, if you could become like one of them, they'd all be all around you. You could see them, but all we can see is the material but it's made up of nothing but microorganisms that are actually alive. Okay? Even the table we're sitting at, or whatever, whatever we can see is made from the microorganisms that we can't see. So it's, when I started learning that, I thought, man, that's pretty profound, So we need to be careful about how we treat things, even the little things that we can't see, and that comes through education, so we can know how to take care of them as well as the things that we can see around us in our environment. So I want to kind of go. Let's go over to, let's see, let's first of all cover where we're at. We're on page 192. So let's go back to LP 7, lesson plan 7, page D. And let's read the step that we're actually on, that Chris left off on. It says, explain to students that in the last 100 years, lifestyles have changed drastically. And boy, have they ever. Think about it. We're in the 2020s. 1920, 100 years ago, they called it the Roaring 20s, right before the Great Depression. They called it the Roaring 20s because people were living large. The stock market was booming. Things were growing, developing in America. And people were living large. They were entertaining themselves and having all kinds of, fun. People were getting rich. There was a lot of multiplication of millionaires in America, etc. And then one day in 1929, I think it was October 29th, 1929, there was a big stock market crash, and we had what was called the Great Depression in America. But prior to back then, this is before. We had cars. Cars were developed. We're going to learn a little bit about that tonight. I'm going to show you actually why they were developed or how they were developed. And I want to prepare you for the fact that most of the things that we see today are because of our drive to have pleasure and entertainment. Our drive to entertain ourselves, to have fun, to seek pleasure, to seek self-gratification, basically. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on here tonight. It says, ask students to name some things that have changed in the last century. Write down the different answers on the board and discuss them. And instruct students to turn in their handbooks to the section entitled, My, How Things Have Changed, found on page 192. Emphasize that technology has had consequences on the environment, and ask students if they can name any of the consequences. Okay, so let's go ahead and then it tells us also to have students turn to page 194 and read What Goes Around Comes Around. Have students complete the accompanying exercise and let them evaluate their answers for the test on page 197. So let's turn over to 191. Just to kind of get a feel where Chris was at when he left off. Page 191, it was talking about it's all about attitude. And, it says your attitude is the way you think and feel about something. To practice self-control regarding the environment, you must have a caring attitude about the world around you. Okay? And, I dare say before you learn the peaceful solution, you really don't care about much. I mean, really, most of our thinking as a teenager. Remember, this is a teenage book. We're learning from an intermediate level book. We're talking about junior high. Okay, so most people in junior high are thinking of three people: me, myself, and I. Not really thinking about everyone else around us. In fact, I think I've told you many times, some of the things that I was told growing up kind of promoted the idea that it was all about me. Like it was kind of like when I would do something to harm somebody, somebody would tell me, you're only hurting yourself when you do that. You're only hurting yourself. When really, no, I was hurting my victim, that I stole from. I was hurting my neighborhood because now other people in the neighborhood were scared because somebody was going around breaking in people's houses, and I was hurting my community because my whole town, because the court system that I was involved in, they had to pay for all my bad choices I was making, police officers, courts, etc., jails, right? I didn't think about all that stuff until I got educated in the peaceful solution at an older age. But a lot of the things, a lot of the sayings that were out there, like, look out for number one, it promoted the idea that it was really all about me. So when you're that young, it's a real benefit to be taught the peaceful solution, because it actually shows it's not just about us. It's about everyone else, and even about the things you can't see, like the microorganisms we've been learning about. So it says, this means not taking the air you breathe, food you eat, or water you drink for granted. When you take something for granted, you assume that it will always be there for your use. But the truth is, like Chris was pointing out last class, remember when the COVID broke out in 2020, how there was a toilet paper shortage? Nobody could find any toilet paper, and it was like, why does everybody need the toilet paper? But you couldn't find any. And there were other items as well. Hand sanitizer, wasn't available, and other items that people were hoarding. And those things that we thought would always be in the store, well, they weren't in the store. And even certain potato chips that I liked, or certain foods that I liked, weren't available. They were gone. Okay? And now, here in 2022, in late 2022, it's the same situation, only worse. Because now we have a war with Russia and Ukraine, and in Ukraine, a lot of the wheat and the grain is grown there, and it's not being produced because of the war. And now we have a huge shortage of different products. It's even worse. Okay, and the things that we thought would always be there, they're just not there. So we took it for granted. It says, the truth is, unless we care for our environment, clean air, water, and nutritious, healthy food will not always be there for our use. And it also asks us, when was the last time you stopped and thought about the fact that you are connected to the earth and it to you? All life forms affect the earth in one way or another. When I look at the earth, I see a big bubble. I see a ball surrounded by reminds me of that movie I watched when I was really, really young, about a boy that used to live in a bubble because he couldn't come out of the bubble. He couldn't come out of that plastic tent, because if he did and he was exposed to any kind of harmful microbes, he would die immediately, because his immune system was so broke down that if he came in contact with any of the outside air outside of that tent, that protective cover, he would die. Okay? Imagine having to live like that. But the earth is in a protective bubble. We start punching holes in the atmosphere, like they've done, I don't know if you've ever heard of the HARP system up in Alaska, but the HARP system is where they send frequencies, radio frequencies, up into the atmosphere to play with it, to punch holes in it. And they were doing it for experiments in the Star Wars program, for missile defense technology and things like this. And they knew they were punching holes in the atmosphere, and they admitted that's what they were doing, but they were acting like, well, there's no real consequences for doing that. Like, it's not really going to hurt us, because they close back up when we're done. The holes close back up. Well, really? There's no harm done when you're messing with, that protective layer, that's over us, and many other such things they do, not really thinking about, the long-term effect of the things they're doing, even the short-term effect of what they're doing. So it says, this interconnectedness can be easily overlooked as you go about daily routine. For example, you don't normally think about the air you breathe because breathing is automatic, nor do many people consider the quality of the water and food they ingest unless they live in an area that's been affected by drought, or they eat something that causes them to become sick. Don't wait until you're adversely affected by contaminants in the environment to take notice of your food, water, and air supply. Develop a caring attitude about the environment, because the quality of your life is affected by the world around you. And and that, again, the caring can only come through education. You know, you have to teach people why they should care. Okay, you have to teach them even what care is. You know, you have to teach them the moral character traits that are in the peaceful solution for them to be able to start focusing on developing that care that they should have. Okay, and then at the bottom, of course, it says, stop and think about what you're putting into your body and how you're treating it, because it's the only body you're going to get. You know, you're not going to be able to take it and trade it in at Walmart or get new parts at the Best Buy for your brain when you destroy it with drugs. You're not going to be able to go buy some more RAM, you know, for your to put into your brain so your memory, you know, is better. You know, no. Once you lose it, you lost it. It's gone. You know. So got to be careful. We got to be careful what we're doing. So let's look at page 192. Chris covered about half the page here, and he talked about how with all these modern conveniences, it's easy to assume there will always be an abundance of supplies and resources at our disposal. Many of the conveniences we've grown accustomed to are relatively new. Talk to your great-grandparents or grandparents and ask them what the world was like when they were your age. And that's why I'm thankful that the author of The Peaceful Solution, Israel Hawkins, used to come to our seminars, and he would always tell us, you know, he was born in 1934 in the Dust Bowl. I think Chris talked a little bit about the Dust Bowl in up there in Oklahoma and North Texas and I think the Dalhart area. How he grew up. You know, they didn't have cars. Well, they had cars, but they didn't have, in his area, not everyone had a car. They had horses and buggies. Or they didn't have running water, you know. They didn't have, you know, pipes and, you know, underground systems for water. They had a well, and he said the only running water we had is we had, you know, my parents had one of us run to the well and fill it up with water and run back with it. That was the running water, okay? And, you know, he would share with us how his family would read by the lamplight. You know, they didn't have electricity. You know, electricity was only for the very wealthy, and he was in a rural area where they didn't have electricity yet. They do now. I've been to that area before. They have electricity today, but back then they didn't have it. And listening to what he would say about the environment back when he was growing up was really interesting, because I thought, in a way, I thought, man, that must have been really, I mean, I'm sure it was hard. It was hard living, you know, having to get your own wood. You know, you didn't just turn the stove on, you know, or microwave your coffee in the morning if you wanted, you know, or something to heat it up. You had to actually work for it. You had to go out and get the wood, build the fire, to heat your water, to take your bath, you know, or wash your dishes. You know, you had in an iron. I used to say, you know, an iron was a real iron back then. You know, what iron is iron. You know, it's and it probably weighed about 50 pounds. And if you dropped it, you would never go through more than one iron. You know, I mean, the iron never broke. But you had to heat that iron on the stove to get it to heat. You know, to get it to, you know, on your wood stove, you had to heat that iron up to be able to get it hot so you could iron your clothes. Today, we just turn on the iron. You know. Well, we call it an iron, but it's really like some kind of aluminum or something, and it always scorches my, you know, my white shirt will always end up with a brown stain on it, and I'll be like, how'd that get there? You know, like, because you're not using a real iron, it's junk, you know, and then you go through 4 or 5 of them, you know, in 1 year, you know, but the old-fashioned way was really great, you know, it really was. It was hard living, though. So I used to think, you know, man, I don't know how you could live without a refrigerator and without, you know, all those modern appliances and washers and dryers. Man, you had to use a number 2 washboard like Chris showed us to wash your clothes. No way, man. You know? And, you know, I used to think, man, that's pretty tough. But then in some ways I used to think that must have been really nice. You know, sitting around with your family, eating a meal. No one's looking at their phone. They didn't have one. The phone's not ringing. The neighbors aren't coming over because they don't have a car to drive over to see you. You know, there's nobody bothering you. You know, it's quiet. You know, some people actually will go to retreats. They'll get rid of their phone. They'll go to retreat somewhere for 3 or 4 days without their phone. And they say, man, it was the best 3 or 4 days of my whole life without that phone, you know. But some people would die without their phone. I guarantee you, they'd die without electricity or a refrigerator or anything else. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too. Now it says, let's look down to the third paragraph. Just a century ago, most people lit their homes with candles or lamps and heated their homes with wood or coal. Electricity was only for the very wealthy. Transportation consisted of horse and buggy. You know, electricity was actually going to be offered free. Nikola Tesla, you know, he was building an electricity gadget, a tower, you know, and I think J.P. Morgan, you know, the bankster in New York, was financing it. And when he asked Nikola Tesla, well, you know, how much money we're going to make from, you know, generating this electricity, and because he said he could provide it to the whole world, at least the known world. And he said, well, how much money are we going to make off this? He says, none. We're going to offer it for free. So I think J.P. Morgan stopped financing that that tower, and it never got finished. So really, it was all about money, which most things are. It's all about generating money, you know, and pleasure seeking somehow. So it says electricity was only for the wealthy. Transportation consisted of horse and buggy. There was no indoor plumbing or toilets that flushed. Instead, there were outhouses, and in many areas, open sewers and garbage heaps breeding flies and diseases. Imagine if you had to wash all your clothes by hand and hang them on the line to dry, or bring buckets of water in and heat it on your wood-burning stove to take a bath. Well, I have hung my clothes on the on a line, and you know what? They dried pretty fast, and it didn't cost me 1 cent. But you run that dryer in your house, I guarantee it's costing you some money, you know. And that's the benefit of, you know, even refrigerators, you know, or refrigerators suck up a lot of electricity. And they also promote waste. A lot of people go out and they buy a bunch of food and they stick it in their refrigerator. It sits there and rots because they never get around to eating it because they bought too much, you know. It used to be that people, I remember the teacher, the author of The Peaceful Solution said his parents, if they bought meat, it was to eat within, you know, that week. You know, it wasn't something that you stored away in the freezer. They didn't have a freezer, you know. Or if they bought, you know, eggs or anything else, it was like seasonal stuff they bought. They didn't just go out and hoard stuff and store it. And, you know, in their refrigerator, because they didn't have one. So they had to be, you know, going to the store ever so often, you know, probably once a month or twice a month to get their supplies, right? But they didn't have some refrigerator they could stick it in for 4 or 5 months or a year, you know, and wait to eat it, you know. So they had to be very selective about what they were buying. And today, people just go out and buy all kinds of food. And a lot of it's wasted. A lot of it promotes a lot of waste, not to mention a high electricity bill. But imagine if you had to do all that, wash your clothes by hand, this and that. Now, you guys probably are thinking, well, I wouldn't have to, you know, because my wife would do it for me. Well, what? I don't think you're, you know, the women used to work very, 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 they still do, but women used to work very, very, very hard. Think about it. You know, well, I mean, that's like really something. When I think about it, well, all that work they had to do. But now we have the shortcuts. You know, we have shortcuts nowadays, right? Can you put up that first slide? I want to show you something about shortcuts. There's no shortcuts to any place worth going. You know, think about that for a minute, you know. I remember when I was walking home from school, I'd always try to take shortcuts through someone's yard or, you know, and then I found out they had a pit bull in there or something, you know. Like, you know, whoa, man, I'm not taking that shortcut again. You know, well, I shouldn't have been taking the shortcut through the yard because I was trespassing in the first place, jumping over somebody's fence, going into their yard, and then I find out after I jumped over the fence, they got a big old dog there, right? That's trying to chew my leg or, you know. So, but whose fault was that, you know? The shortcuts get us in a lot of trouble when we try to take shortcuts. When we try to go around things and try to get things done quicker or whatever, it always ends up in a bad place. Can you show the next slide? It's like trying to disinfect your house in 10 minutes. You know how to do that? Just put a gallon of bleach and a gallon of dish soap in the washing machine. And you'll have that effect that you see right there. That's called disinfecting your house in 10 minutes, right? Where it would normally take you, a day. That's probably just a joke, but it shows you how silly it is to take shortcuts, right? Shortcuts always lead to a bad place. So it says, with modern technology, we've advanced by leaps and bounds. Now, this isn't talking about morally. This is talking about technologically, right? For instance, the refrigerator, washer and dryer, as well as indoor plumbing and hot water are ways that technology has simplified our lives and made our daily routines far more pleasant, freeing up time for other activities like playing video games, watching television, and sitting and vegging out with your friends. Right? Freeing us up for more time to waste, basically, right? I'm going to tell you right now, our society, our generation is the worst, most, I hate to say this, but I'm just going to be blunt, laziest, most spoiled, uneducated generation that there's been. They said, I was reading an article recently, it said, if America was attacked by a foreign country, most people wouldn't even get off their couch, They would just let them take over, Or if a nuclear bomb exploded in a nearby city, they'd just sit and watch it on TV or something, They wouldn't even get up to make preparations for it coming to their city, And it's true, there's so much laziness, there's so much inactivity because there's so much entertainment being offered to people, and that's all they do is entertain themselves. For the most part, not everybody, not you, and not people that are being educated about, the negative effects of, entertainment, the entertainment that's being offered today. It says, with the Industrial Revolution came factories that mass-produce a variety of supplies for consumers. The invention of cars and planes made transportation quicker and more efficient. Yeah, it made it quicker and more efficient. But if you want to know the real, because everything starts out, would you agree that everything always starts out kind of innocent? Like great intentions. People have great intentions, for the most part. They when something starts out, they usually have great intentions and they have a certain goal they want to see be accomplished. But then it gets in certain people's hands and it turns into something else, and it's usually a money-making scheme, some kind of pyramid scheme, right? Let's look at the next slide because I want to show you the real deal about transportation. This is to the left picture is the very first drilling site for oil. It's a derrick. That's in 1859 in, let's see, where was that? Titusville, Pennsylvania. That's an oil derrick. But oil really exploded there in, let's see, it says, the picture on the right, January 10th, 1901, the Lucas Geyser in Port Arthur, Texas. It actually increased oil production by 3 times the amount of oil was being produced in America, and it made America on its way to being the greatest world power. Okay, when this oil came out, by the way, the Chinese discovered oil in 600 BC. Actually, it says they were running oil through bamboo pipes, and they were also refining oil. Okay, so it's not like a new thing, but the mass production of oil, okay, like you see here, really began what we see with this huge increase of technological advancement. And I'm going to talk particularly about automobiles tonight, okay, because I want you to understand that there's more than meets the eye with all this. It's not just about getting around from place to place. Yes, it's great that we can drive. I mean, let's face it, if you had to drive, if you had to walk 20 miles to work every day, I mean, that would take you all day to get to work. And so you wouldn't be able to get there, right? In time to work. So having a vehicle has been a great, great, great benefit to mankind. And no, the smog or the stuff coming out the tailpipe and going out in the atmosphere is not causing global warming, like Chris indicated and like David indicated. That's not what's causing global warming, or climate change, as they call it. That's not causing it. In fact, that dissipates into the atmosphere. There's microorganisms that are up there in that atmosphere that can take care of that. Okay, they can take care of it. All right. It's not doing any kind of permanent damage to our environment to run cars or to produce oil. That's not the problem. You're going to learn the problems. Chris has already been telling you, David's been telling you what these problems are. But we're going to get deeper into it. But let's talk about the cars. Let's talk about the oil in cars for a minute. By the way, I was coming into the Peaceful Solution headquarters tonight to teach class, and I spilled water on my computer and it's not working, so I have to look at them. I'm having a hard time looking at these small photos here on my phone. I'm thankful for the technical guys that were able to send me the slideshow. I'm going to try to get to the slide I need to get to. Okay, can you show the next slide? Because I want to show you a horse and buggy. Because it shows you here that transportation consisted of horse and buggy there for, before the cars. You know how much that buggy cost? $25 to $50 back in that day. That picture there was taken in 1910 in Oklahoma. And a buggy I wanted to find out how much a buggy cost. It was only $25 to $50 for a buggy. But don't fool yourself, If you think that horse was free, you know how much a horse eats? Now, you got to put gas in your car, right? You got to feed your car gas and oil and things to run it, but you got to feed that horse too. I want to show you something about a horse's appetite. Why don't you go to the next slide? I'm going to show you something about a horse. If you think they're cheaper than a car, well, not all horses. It says, unlike any other humans, horses do not ever get full when they eat. The truth is, they can actually eat twice as much the needed amount of hay without having a single belch. These equines, I don't remember how, it's called horses. These horses spend more time eating than to any other activity. Hence, they can get higher probability of becoming overweight if owners do not control the amount of hay feeding for their horses. As a matter of fact, horses do not possess that ability to control their eating habits, and they wouldn't really know whether they had already met the needed nutrients and all. Another thing is that they just don't stop eating until they get tired of chewing. So, when you put gas in your car, you're done. It's filled, right? But your horse, he doesn't know when it's full. Okay, so with the prices of hay today in America to feed your horse, unless you got grass, unless you got a pasture you can put them out there and let them mow your lawn or whatever, it's going to be pretty costly to operate that horse and buggy. Okay, a lot of times we don't think about that. Not only that, you can park your car for 6 months and go somewhere else, go to another town, but you can't park your horse for 6 months and come back. It'll be dead unless you have someone to take care of it and feed it the whole time and make sure it's taken care of, right? So a horse can be pretty costly. Don't get me wrong, Cars can be costly, but horses can be even costlier. But what do you think is going to get you there faster? The car is going to outdo the horse, right? All right, so let's go to the next slide because I want to show you another car. This is the first car, actually. This is the first car. It was called a Benz. It says the Benz Patent Motor Car Number 1. This is from, the patent was given on November 2nd, 1886. It's considered the world's first motor vehicle and thus marks the birth of the modern automobile. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. I want to show you another automobile. This is a Ford Model T. They called it a Tin Lizzie. It was produced by Ford Motor Company from October 1908 to May of 1927. It says, with 16.5 million sold, it is named the most influential car of the 20th century. This is what put people on the road, okay? This is what put people on American roads. There was only a couple of them. Well, let me talk about that. There was roads back then, they weren't very great. They were basically paths with a bunch of ruts, right? They were extremely, and I want to try to kind of get you to understand. I don't know. Can you put that picture back up so you can see those tires? You see those tires on that Model T right there? You know how hard those tires were? Those tires were like rock solid, okay? You couldn't pop that tire. You would go through 3 cars before you went through a tire. That's how rugged those tires were. They only started making those air tires with the tubes in them, you know, where they could get a flat when they figured out, hey, we got to sell more tires. You know, we're not selling any tires. We got to make more money. So let's make tires that don't last very long so they can come and buy some more. Remember? Money making. It's all about money making. They still could make tires like this, where you would never get a flat. But it wouldn't make money, you know? We got to sell some rubber, right? Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide. See what I got here. So the roads were really, really bad. You know, they were basically paths. So in 1880, there was a group called Good Roads, and they pretty much expanded into different, and it actually didn't start about cars. It was about bicycles. Bicycles were a big deal before the cars. And bicyclers started a group called Good Roads because they wanted to improve the roads for the bicyclers. Well, the cars came around, and another group came on the scene called AAA, which was the American Automobile Association. And we'll talk about that here in a minute, because I'm going to show you what it grew into. It started out pretty innocent. You know, some bicyclers wanted better roads to bicycle on, right? Well, then the car came around as they were developing, the Good Roads system in all these different states that were part of this Good Roads system. AAA came around after the automobile came around, and they started working for better roads for the vehicles to drive on. Let's go to the next slide. Actually, don't go to the next slide yet. You see that picture on the right? That is the Lincoln Highway. That's the first it started in Times Square in New York, and it went all the way to San Francisco, across the whole country. It was the first highway. And you know what? There was only one sign. One sign. It says, it shows this guy here. It says, the AAA Good Roads official passes the only road sign on his transcontinental auto trip in Glendale, Montana, where it shows you how many miles left to get to Denver or somewhere, Salt Lake City. Only one sign on the whole road. Today, how many signs do we have on the roads? You couldn't count them. There's signs for everything, man. You know how much those signs cost? Think about it. Those signs cost a lot of money. They had mile markers. They've got all the, signs for, where you're getting off on exits and stuff. Those things are very expensive. And you know what? I used to live in Houston, and I would go in these underpasses, and I would look at those signs, and there'd be spray paint all over the sign. Like somebody got up their sign. I don't know how they did it. They would somehow climb on top of these, very dangerous locations, and they would spray paint gang signs and stuff on the signs. And those signs had to be replaced. You couldn't leave it like that. It was very unsightly. And but I always thought, the person that spray painted that sign, I wonder if they realize they're actually going to have to pay for that sign, whether they realize it or not. They got to pay taxes. And, you know, it's the people that end up paying for that sign. You know, they just raise the taxes and they put another sign up. So we're the ones paying for these things. But the point is there's millions of signs now everywhere, okay? And they cost a lot of money. Let's go to the next slide. I want to show you about AAA. It was founded in 1902 by a guy named, one of the guys, his name was Augustus Post. He was an original founder of the American Automobile Association, and he lived in New York City. AAA as we know it today. It's AAA is where, you know, you break down on the road. If you have AAA, you know, they'll come and, you know, they'll do certain services for you. It's kind of like car insurance, right? If you break down. Now, but we're advancing now. I want to show you how this all started out, you know, the Good Roads program to develop the roads for better bicycling conditions. And then the cars came around and they said, well, let's not just advocate for better bicycling conditions. We need better roads for cars. Why? Because the oil industry, which started back, you know, around that same time, needed to sell oil. Because cars take what? They need oil and gas, right? So there's got to be a way to sell this oil, automobiles. And of course, along the roads, you're going to need what's called gas stations, right? So you can sell your gasoline. So let's look at the next slide, because this is the Lincoln Highway. And this is one of the advertisements. Actually, it's an old advertisement. It says that, you know, a Texaco station is never more than an hour, or it's never more than an hour from a Texaco pump, you know, on the Lincoln Highway, which went from Times Square all the way to San Francisco. Okay. They had Texacos all along the path there to sell their gasoline. And what they were promoting was people getting out and exploring, getting out of their house, go out and just drive and explore the country. Get out and seek pleasure and have fun. Get out of your house, get out of your city and go explore everywhere, you know, and just drive and consume gas and oil, right? Because before that, what did people do? Well, for the most part, they stayed at home. You know, they stayed at home. They worked on the farm. You know, they would go into town occasionally. If they didn't live in a town, they would go to the town and they would buy groceries and supplies that they needed. And then they would go back home and they would live a quiet life with their family. I'm talking for the most part, and I'm talking about here in America. You children know why they have summer school. I mean, why they let you out of school for the summer. It wasn't because, you know, the teachers needed a break, even though now that's probably why they do it. It was because the children had to help the parents on the farm, because almost everyone had a farm. And it was harvest time, and the children would stay home during the summer and they would help their parents gather in the harvest. Now they still have summer school, but only less than 1% of people in America even know a farmer. Okay? But everything really centered around the home life. And what this promoted was get out, explore, go have fun. So the Lincoln Highway was the first transcontinental highway, in other words, across America. That was, by the way, 1912 when the Lincoln Highway was dedicated. 1913, sorry. So let's go to the next slide. Now in 1926, another highway was developed from Chicago to Santa Monica, California. It was called Route 66. And it went from Chicago, as you can see on the route here, it went through Missouri, went through Oklahoma, went through Texas, went through Arizona, let's see, Nevada, and it ended in Santa Monica, on the Santa Monica Pier there at the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. If you can go to the next slide, I'll show you. All along that route, you know, you had the Phillips 66 station, you know, and, you know, it was about selling gasoline and oil, you know, we gotta have, and tires too, you know, and car parts and whatever else. But it promoted people getting out and getting out of the home and exploring, seeking pleasure and having fun. In fact, they used to have a song, what was it? Get Your Kicks on Route 66. Because all along the route there was hotels and bars and entertainment. You know, you could go and just drive down that road, all carefree, spend your money on gasoline and oil, and stop at places and spend your money along the way. And, you know, certain people, believe it or not, in every town along the way, they were all making money off this thing. And they promoted it. They promoted this route. These routes where people could go, and businesses opened up all along those highways just to serve those people that were just out there driving, going from Chicago to Santa Monica on Route 66, because someone told them, man, go out there and get your kicks on Route 66. Have fun, entertain yourself, seek pleasure, get out of the house, you know, go live it up. Let's go to the next slide. And why did they call it Route 66? It's really interesting. I read about it. I thought it was kind of interesting. A guy named Cyrus Avery, he's called the father of Route 66. He was a business person, an oil man, and a highway commissioner who lived in Oklahoma. And it says that Avery shared Henry Johnson's belief of numerology and the power of 66, and thus settled on designating the highway system Route 66. 6 being a number to bring about and manifest material pleasure and good fortune. In other words, he believed the number 66, if we named it Route 66, it would promote pleasure, material pleasure and entertainment, and good fortune, meaning lots of money. You don't think people, you know, when you go into a store, you don't think they just place items, you know, on the shelf indiscriminately, right? You know that they have marketers that know exactly where to put every item, okay? You know, they put the candy right there at the checkout stand for a reason. So your children will sit there and grab the candy and say, Mom, can I have this? You know, they know because you're standing there, you know, and you're looking at the magazines and you're thinking, oh, yeah, look at that magazine. So they put the magazines there so you'll pick it up and start reading it and you'll probably buy it. They know that. They place things there for a reason. Nothing's done for no reason. Do you remember what we learned in the character unit about more than meets the eye, the very first chapter of the character unit in the Peaceful Solution? More than meets the eye means you better look, you can look behind everything that man does and you'll always find an ulterior motive. Okay? And these roads, yeah, it might have started out, yeah, we need better roads, you know, so we can, you know, drive our cars and our bicycles, you know, where they don't ruin, you know, they don't get ruined and they're more comfortable and they're more people friendly or whatever. But it developed into something else. It developed into selling oil, selling gas, seeking pleasure, and getting out of the house. And that led to some other things. What do you think it led to? Well, let's go to the next slide. You know, right around that time, you had the advent of television, you know, with the 1934, the first public display of a television set was on August 25th. Philo Farnsworth, he showed a picture of the moon on a television screen, and I think it was in Philadelphia. First public display of TV, 1934. By 1949, people started getting them en masse in their homes. And you see this woman here, she's sitting there ironing her clothes, and she, soap operas are one of the first things they put on the TV. Soap operas. And women were normally at home, taking care of the house. Okay? If they weren't out on Route 66 or the Lincoln Highway, they were at home ironing their clothes for their children or their husband, doing their normal routine, taking care of the house. And they got that television in their house. They started watching these soap operas that were promoting what? The idea that, men with other women, having fun, partying. I think the author of The Peaceful Solution said on all the soap operas, people were either in trouble, they were just getting in trouble, they were in the middle of trouble, right? Or they were just getting out of trouble, right? But there was always trouble, right? So the women, they sit there and watch these soap operas, and they thought, you know what? They look like they're having so much fun out there, and here I am just ironing my husband's clothes. Man, I need to get out there and have fun too. I need to go seek pleasure. I need to go and look for something to do. Man, this is boring here, It looks like they're having a lot of fun out there. I'm missing something, right? Well, yeah, they're missing something. They were missing something. Let me show you what they were missing. Let's go to the next slide, because I know I'm going to kind of skip a little something here, but I'll go back to it. All the smog, when you think of cars, you think of smog, right? You think, man, those cars, look what they're doing. They're causing people to have asthma, right? It says, here's an article that says toxic UK air triggering chronic lung conditions and life-threatening asthma attacks for millions. Am I saying that the air... Man, I used to live by Baytown, Texas, where the biggest oil refinery in the United States of America is located. And when you drive by there, it literally smells like pickles. I mean, dill pickles. It's so horrible. The air. I don't know how anyone can even work in the refinery. It's horrible. But it says... this article is saying that it's, when people read these things, they think, wow, these things are causing people to have asthma. But the truth is, the asthma, if you look to the right, it says that it's very common. There's more than 3 million cases per year in the U.S. And it says that it's, if you look at the bottom, the exact cause of asthma is not known. It is suspected to be due to genetic and or environmental factors. Genetic, meaning it's something that's passed down to somebody. Okay? So that means it wasn't caused by smog or air pollution, although that might, exacerbate the problem or whatever. That's not what caused it. I want to show you what caused it. Okay, because we're talking about cars, automobiles right now. Let's go to the next slide. I want you to look at that word. I want to remind you of a word that I showed you once. Okay? I put 2 arrows there because I want you to notice this subtlety of the trickery here in this word. It's the word dis-ease. Now, the first thing I want you to notice, do you notice how they put a little dot between they put D-I-S and a dot and then the word ease. That means they broke it into 2 because it's a 2-part word. Dis-ease. They're right. The way they did that right there is correct. It's dis-ease. But then look what they did below it in the pronunciation. They put a D-E and a Z-E-Z, like disease, disease, disease. You see that? When at the top it shows very plainly it's dis-ease, but they want you to pronounce it disease. They're throwing you off. They're trying to throw you off from the cause of dis-ease. And some of the synonyms for disease, dis-ease, are illness, sickness, infection, ailment, disorder, abnormality, defect, contagion, canker, cancer, infirmity, defect, abnormality, blight, contagion, bug, virus, pestilence, plague, trouble. Notice all those synonyms? Those come from dis-ease. Don't be fooled by the pronunciation. They're trying to throw you off when they plainly showed it's dis-ease above, and then they say pronounce it like this, disease. Okay. So I told you they built the roads, and they told people to go seek pleasure. They showed them on television what they're missing, and all the women thought, man, I'm missing something. I got to get out there and I got to seek pleasure out there in the world. My home is too boring, This job that I was given, that was a really honorable job, by the way, to be I always kind of chuckle when I hear women when I say, so what do you do? Oh, I'm just a housewife. Just a housewife? I'm just a mom. Just a mom? I understand. I don't comprehend it, but I understand that's a lot of work, okay? And I'd rather be digging ditches all day than to have 8 children around me screaming and doing this and that, right? So, okay, so let's look at the last slide. I'm going to give you a preview of the next class because I want to show you what they were missing when they were staying home. What they were missing is all the STDs. Here's what they were missing. They were missing the diseases. All these diseases, which, by the way, right now the CDC is saying that the STDs, the sexually transmitted diseases that Chris was getting ready to show you some pictures of the other night, I think he'll probably eventually show them. They are a plague. They are an epidemic. They are out of control. And how did they get out of control? Because of this promotion of the seeking the pleasure and the entertainment. Get out and enjoy yourself. Go out and meet people. Go out and have the party. Go out to the party. Have fun. Go to the bar. Go with your friends out there and mingle. Go mingle with everyone, They called it the swinging 60s, right? Okay, so notice this article. This is from Live Science. It came out in 2007. Right after we had a seminar here with the author of The Peaceful Solution, Israel Hawkins, and he told us that STDs are actually in the water, they're in the soil, they're in the atmosphere, that these viruses travel, these bacteria travel in the air and they get into everything. This article came out on Live Science. It says, herpes virus killing coral reefs. This is from June 20th, 2007. It says coral gets cold sores too. Only for corals, a herpes virus infection isn't just annoying, it can be lethal. And it and other diseases are possibly a big factor in the deaths of coral reefs that humans are causing throughout the world's ocean. Humans are causing it. Well, how are humans causing coral reef to get herpes? That's an STD. Well, where do people go to go swimming? To go pleasure seeking? They go to the beach. How many people that go to the beach have an STD? How many STDs get into the water, into the sand? Stay tuned for the next class because I want you to see what this actually promoted. Remember, they started off on the with great intentions. Better better roads for bicycling and cars, and this is where it ends up. But you haven't seen anything yet, so be here. Next class is. Sorry, my hold on. I got to check with my calendar over here. Today's 10/2, so it should be 10/5, right? 10/5, 2022 at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. You've been a great audience. Please keep practicing the peaceful solution. We'll see you next time.